lot of fascinating material you have on what enablement is a very complex question. One of my questions is, did you look at the sex distribution of the children and parents' aspirations for, I mean, the two examples you gave, people want a boy and a girl.
Yes.
So are you saying that 2 is the ideal family size, a boy and a girl? Because one thing that was so interesting was that too many boys were seen as a liability, whereas in the past, more boys would be seen as a benefit.
I have a student, the qualitative student I talked about, who's actually writing a paper on this right now and probably will focus her dissertation on an issue related to this. What she's seeing on close reading of these transcripts, and then we'll probably do some quantitative analysis to look at this, is perhaps, she thinks, driven by the intense labor migration of men, mostly of men. She's seeing an increase in daughter valuation. Doesn't necessarily above boys, but in the past it would have been strongly valuation of boys and much lower valuation of girls. But because sons are seen as leaving, and sometimes their wives are also a way, they're seen as being less important for supporting the family in old age. They're also seen as having weaker ties because of distance. Girls, daughters, for instance, often stay in the area, even if they're married to a labor migrant. They might stay themselves. In fact, in some cases, they might stay in their natal household. So she is arguing that you can actually see an increase in the valuation of daughters that might be related to the system. Now, clearly, what you see now, people say 2 and they say 1 boy and a girl. Those are by far the modal answers, by far. But you still see there are more people who say they prefer boys than girls, but there are about half as many who say they prefer girls. It's a complicated business, but there's, in other words, there may be a shift away from that traditional South Asian trend towards son valuation.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I also have a question about the relationships between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, and about the ways in which a woman is empowered in the family. And so I was surprised to see that they desire only 1 son. If they have more sons, wouldn't it mean that they would have more daughters-in-law who would serve them? Because they complain about work also. Most of your examples, those women complain about work, but if they have daughters-in-law, they would have. So it would be interesting to see more about the power, about the relationships between them. And I also have a question about the infertility.
Yes.
I mean, does it also have an effect in the decrease of fertility? Is there an increase in infertility? Do these people have access to these assisted reproductive technologies or so?
Okay.
Don't?
Infertility, anything one could argue is infertility in this population is extremely low. We have about 10 older women in the sample with no children. And 5 of them, it looks like they have no children because they were divorced or deserted at a very young age, so before they had children. Other women, it looks like they had children who died. So it's, most women get married at a young age here. The average age at marriage in the sample is late teens to about 20 or 21. And they tend to have children very soon after marriage, even highly educated women typically complete their education, get married, have a couple of children, and then stop having children. And so infertility is just not, it's not really seen as a big thing in this population. There are some women who are infertile. Women ascribe that to, the social gloss for that is fertilizer, but essentially what's meant is pollution potentially from chemicals that are used, pesticides and chemicals that are used on crops, but that's not necessarily. This is an area where they do really intensive medical research. I don't know if the evidence for that is actually very good, but the rates are quite low. So it's not like sub-Saharan Africa or something. And then in terms of dynamics in the household, mothers-in-law clearly, traditionally have had a lot of power over daughters-in-law. But if the daughters-in-law, that's true, it's true even now, but if the daughters-in-law are increasingly better educated than their mothers-in-law, this is a classic thing in a lot of parts of South Asia. There's more tension between the daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. If the woman's sons are increasingly living outside of the local area, then that may also, and the daughters-in-law sometimes move with them, that might mean that the daughter-in-law is no longer actually even in the household. And so this is actually one of the reasons why my student is developing this argument or wrote her proposal suggesting that this may undercut the ability of the mother-in-law to have the daughter-in-law to help her, and that might be increasing daughter valuation because of that, the more tenuous tie or more tenuous control over the daughter-in-law. But that's a recent trend.
You had that quote by Kaplan where you talked about the embodied capital coupled with transmission. Maybe in your data set of 65,000 or from some other set, if you have some idea of the number of children that other people in the village have, and you load that in as a variable, that way, if it's just embodied capital, that shouldn't matter. But
that's right, but if it's cultural transmission, it should. We, in the big data set, we can get that information. So one thing we're going to do for the mortality is we're actually going to calculate, and this is labor intensive, we're going to calculate village level mortality rates, and we could also calculate village level fertility rates or something like that. And that, so if we're doing one, we could do the other relatively easily, and you're right, I think that's a good thing. Let me get this down. We also might be able to do it by the BARI, which is an even more close and intensive unit. Yes. Yeah. Well, we would do this by, well, the idea with the mortality rates is we probably do it by years or by 5-year increments. And so we could do it the same way. We might, I mean, with the children, we might not be able to get the most perfect count, but we should be able to get something. At the very least, we should be able to calculate fertility rates by village for 5-year increments or 1-year increments. So that we can do, and they actually have crude death and birth rates already posted on ICDDRB in their materials by village, but that's not the same as the actual rates. And so we can look at those, but that's not getting us where we want to be. But that's a very good idea. Yes.
So 2 things. The first, I suggest only half ingest. Well, measuring, what proxies for cultural transmission one chooses is very problematic. This is a stumbling block that we've run into over and over again.
Yes.
At first pass, something like mobile phone use makes all kinds of sense, but there's always the possibility, as your fertilizer example suggests. I mean, it could be the case that men who carry mobile phones in their pockets have lower male fertility, and that's, you're going to get a correlation there, but it's not because of cultural transmission. So that's my half ingest. Now, my more serious remark, you'll notice that Clark and I have taken our phones out of our pockets.
Except there's this also an effect for women, and I don't know. Go on. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
I suppose
but if they are,
yes,
if
it's
there's
true.
no extra pair copulation, then it takes 2, right?
Yes, there is. I would say this is a low extra pair copulation
That's what
situation.
I
Yes.
So the other thing is, questions about exposure to radio, billboards, that kind of thing. I worry a lot that those are too that people really don't have any accurate way. You can ask, do you have a radio in the home? But how often you've seen this billboard? That's really going to be noisy. So instead, I would like to see something like an actual test that's measuring knowledge. So
Sure.
At a general level, it could be something like, name these, Bollywood movie stars. At a more specific level, if it's anything like Indonesia, which has this huge family planning program and has for decades, there are all these little jingles and phrases about contraception and family size. Right? And complete the jingle, right? What happens next? Right? I mean, if you know the jingle, then obviously you've gotten exposed to it. And if you don't, well, maybe you got exposed, but it didn't stick, and that's what matters for the cultural transmission.
One thing we do have, unfortunately this is only for a part of the sample right now, and I need to go get it for the rest of the people, and I have some students go in the field in the fall, hopefully they'll do this. We have women list how many kinds of contraception are available, how many kinds of contraception they've heard of. That's the closest thing I have right now to like that. But actually, the lists definitely vary in length, and some women know really like lots of kinds, and lots of stuff is available there actually. It's quite surprising. And this was not like some of the early programs in India where forced sterilization. This is almost all, it started with Depo-Provera shots, and then you've got pills, and you've got condoms, and you've got IUDs, and those are the kind of common use. So that's what we've got right now. I agree with you. And we could potentially, there's some places where we might.
So, I mean, the medical knowledge, that is obviously connected to the cultural transmission, but what you want in part is just what is the ideal family size, right? So in Indonesia, they have this, it used to be the case, I don't know now, but it was blanketed everywhere, which was, the happy, prosperous family, and they're all raising two fingers like this, and they're saying 2 kids is enough, boys and girls are the same, right? And if you walked into any, but the most remote villages in Indonesia, and you said to somebody, complete the jingle, 2 kids is enough, they'd say boys and girls are the same, because everybody knows that, right? Now, people who don't know that have obviously not gotten the message, regardless of how much they know about, the difference between an IUD and a diaphragm or something like that.
I just thought about that when you were saying this. I'm not sure that it's exactly, but we have something sort of like that. We asked people to list their belief about contraception. And they could list more than one, and we had them free list it, but we had this series of codes that we had made because some of them are really common, and then we have another code. And some of the things that people commonly list are these kinds of things that are almost like contraception knowledge jingles. Not all of them are, but some of them might be amenable to looking at in that way. Like if they list this particular one. Also the qualitative data that we have. Frequently, the phrasing, from what I understand, I wasn't on a lot of the qualitative interviews because I was mainly on the survey stuff and working on that really intensively. But from what I understand from my student who was out on most of the qualitative interviews, is that there were some phrases that women would use over and over, and we have audio recordings of it. And so we could look, for instance, at the frequency of particular phrases had been, and that's 51, it's not everyone, but she's about to go through 30 more interviews, and so there's things like that we could get at, even though it wouldn't be for everyone. It would be a subsample to get a sense of, is this inconsistent with some other piece of information?
Yeah, particularly if those phrases are kind of idioms, or they're not the way that a native speaker of that language would necessarily phrase it. It's been imported, right? They've gotten this terminology somewhere.
Well, at least from more educated Bangladeshis, even if not necessarily from abroad. Yeah. Yes.
So I was wondering if you could parse this out by, I know you're controlling for age, but instead of getting rid of that variance, actually looking at different causal mechanisms at different points in time. So what education, getting to it, maybe a 6-year-old woman getting to a 6th grade education was the equivalent of a woman today getting to an 11th grade education. And so you could do something like, there would be a bunch of interactions possibly, and that maybe there you get risk showing up earlier.
Especially earlier, you might see that. So for instance, it strikes me that one of the most obvious ways to begin that would be to look at these 3 different groups of women that we took the equal samples of. Because you've got women who are essentially 20 to 34 and then 35 to 49, et cetera. And so we could compare across those groups of women, look at maybe even similar kinds of models or something. You could look at various things and look at exactly what because you're right, I would expect that risk would be more important early on, absolutely, before the infant mortality rates get as low as they currently are. When the infant mortality rate is up at 120, or I don't know if you compare the TFR data from ICDDRB with our surviving children data, basically women at the same age range are having 6 children, and at least one of those is dying on average. So you have 5 surviving children. And so the early part of the sample, that's quite high. Later on, that becomes 0.1 of a child or something like that, that difference between TFR and surviving children. So yes, I agree. Let me...
Possibility is that you need to get ideas. So there's there are various versions, I guess, of the mixed investment cultural transmission model, right? But one is that you need to get the idea of what's important to invest in, and then you have the investment model mechanisms taking over. But you need the idea that education is important first. So I don't know if you could get at the same kind of possible trajectory that way.
I agree that that's true, but I've been thinking about this a lot in the past month or two. How do you tease them apart? At what point do you become? Because it's true, you have this idea that education is more important. And it's true that potentially one way you get that idea is through cultural transmission. But if you really know objectively that in many cases education results in more income, whether or not you're actually choosing, this idea that education is important may be coming to you, but whether or not you actually invest in education of your children might be partially dependent on that, and partially also dependent on your ecological circumstances, how much money you have, what your other children are doing, so I mean, the question is, I still find that, I see that, but in a practical terms, I still struggle with how you could actually parse that out in a way that really somehow gets rid of investment motivations that people over and over say, this is why education is important, this is why I would invest in my children.
So although wouldn't like the choice to privilege income and market economy goods over land, for example, be another kind of choice, idea
Sure.
of what is the investment currency?
It's
So
true.
income isn't like obviously the currency, right?
Okay.
But I don't know.
Right, it's true though. If you looked at what people spent their income on, and we don't have a lot of direct data on this, but the ICD would be a big sample. They have like a list of what you have in your house, for instance. And they have some measures of income, though they're not that good, comparatively speaking. It is true that you could look at things like that, and you could look at the transition, or I would say, in modern context, almost everyone's going to have some traditional and some kind of modern kinds of good in their house, but you could look at the mix and the relationship between that with income and look at how it tracked with something like reduction in land. Because land is interesting in the sense that you can use it as a primary form of production yourself, but you can also do this dual strategy where you rent out the land to someone and then you engage in this is like all the Brahmins in South India, going to be doctors in the city and renting out their land. So there's some things that could be done like that. And I can think about how we could do it in more detail. I think the HGSS data, yes. Sorry, okay, sorry.
So I'm wondering if there's any reason to think that the processes that make a larger section of society go through the demographic transition is different from the factors that would predict which particular individuals will be at the front of that curve versus behind. Because it seems a little bit like your data addresses the latter, which individuals are increasing their fertility faster. But it seems like the most classic data that lower mortality pushes the society over the other, it's not coming out in your data, maybe because of
It's possible.
differences in the two levels.
I can see that. I guess the question is, the reason I think about it this way is that I'm interested in individual behavior. I think ultimately that's what you want to explain. And so looking at the individual level I think is important for that reason. If you can, I can attempt to incorporate some of these larger kinds of ideas in terms of some variables that would act on individuals. For instance, just the example there about whether you live in this intervention area or whether you don't. There are more variables like that that could potentially be incorporated. But so I guess that is possibly true. But at the same time, I feel like if you want to explain individual behavior, I feel like looking at individual behavior is the first thing to do. And it's true that there might be some greater forces at work that I could then later incorporate or do something on a macro level. There are a lot of demographers already sort of working on a macro level within a country, this rate and this rate, predicting this rate. But I feel like the problem with a lot of that research is that it's so coarse-grained that individual levels of motivation and behavior are really often lost at that. So there are kind of detailed differences that you might see in people's strategies within a society that are really lost in that kind of information. So I guess part of that is that that's not my ultimate goal in explaining it, though I think it's a worthy thing to look at. And if you do have suggestions of how that might be more better incorporated in this, I think that would be useful. So.
I think the problem that Sarah's getting at is, so in these cross-cultural gang experiments that we did, if you looked at individual market contact in any particular society, it never predicted anything.
Okay.
If you looked at the average market contact in different societies, it had a big predictive force. And my interpretation of that is that the market contact doesn't work directly through influencing the motives that individuals have. It works by local cultures adapt to a moral system that works well at the particular level of market contact. And then everybody locally basically imbibes the same moral system, and then that generates cost and benefits that they
Right,
live
or
with.
that,
So-
yes.
So I'd be interested in, I mean, there's a lot of different cultural models, but the one that we sketch in that example, which is really just an example. It's
Right,
not,
right.
I would be not shocked if it's completely wrong, but it has to do with different prestige systems that arise with modernization. And so I'd like to know what people admire.
Yep.
So if you told people, if you used vignette methods and you told people stories about a rich landowner who has a television and whatever it is that you can buy with this money, and then you tell them a story about a doctor or a teacher who also has these things, and then ask them to rank people in some way that would measure their prestige, what you want your kids to be like. Our story would say that it's the shift from a world where being a rich farmer is the top of the pyramid to a world in which there are a lot of other options which are equally or more prestigious. That's what drives the increased investment in education. And so some measure of what people, a less coarse measure of what people think is a desirable outcome for somebody in their life. What kind of person is admirable? It seems to me you could get that if you're doing these qualitative interviews. So anyway, that would be a suggestion.
No, that's a good one. I also feel like the existing qualitative interviews we have right now could be coded with that in mind, because we probably already have some data. And then I have the student who's going back to do more. And so she's interested in this daughter valuation thing, but the thing is, she might be interested in adding some questions, or I could send a different student with questions. I think looking at it, just a general idea of what you're discussing, people talk about they're interested in their children having these high prestige occupations, a lot of which are education based. But they also see it as very unrealistic in many cases, not always, but in many cases. And that's sort of related to the problem of children not wanting to go to school and things like this. So they also see other things as very high prestige, like going abroad for work. If you ask women, what does your husband do abroad? Very many of them don't even know what their husband does abroad, because all of the prestige is wrapped up in the husband's earning and sending money home. And so there is this very interesting focus on prestige that's sort of education and that related to those kinds of things, modern prestige systems. But you still have this, I think the labor migration system has a different set of prestige, which is much more focused on income. And so I would suggest that you might have an answer that's a little bit more like some of the quotes I showed you, where you've got both of them exist in this kind of same word and they're seen as different strategies. But I might get that. But I think that you're right, we could be more specific in that and ask questions of this nature.